the ways that they operate in practice. So before I start to talk about some of the ways that we categorize audits, I just wanted to point people to the report that I've brought up here and some of the resources that we have on the LEAP4SME website. So as well as this report, which offers some practical guidance to businesses around energy audits, we also publish a series of reports which look at different audit environments and examples across different EU countries, and made some recommendations about how those lessons can be learned and applied in a UK context. So we think they're really useful resources and worth taking a look at, and they can be found on this link on the slide here. So beginning with the fundamentals and what the definition of an energy audit is, there are a few definitions out there, but we feel that this one provides the most complete picture. So an energy audit being a systematic procedure with the purpose of obtaining adequate knowledge of the existing energy consumption profile of a building or a group of buildings, an industrial, commercial operation or installation, or a private or public service, identifying and quantifying cost-effective energy-saving opportunities and reporting the findings. And as well as identifying energy-saving opportunities, we're also keen that businesses are advised on carbon-saving opportunities and how these relate to energy and cost-saving measures, which is an increasingly important element of energy audits in both the UK and an EU context. So thinking about how we categorize different audits, one of the most common types is based on ISO standards and reflects their level of complexity. So level 1 audits covering broad identification of energy saving opportunities, including low cost or no cost opportunities, and a rapid assessment of the cost benefit of identified potential improvements. And this will be a very general overview, not dissimilar from a residential energy assessment, and less useful for businesses with sector specific high energy use equipment or processes. Level 2 audits are another level more complex. They provide a more detailed assessment of energy use data and focus on assessing business case in more detail. And SMEs that we've spoken to tended to find this level of assessment provides more actionable steps and is more useful. And then the level 3 audits, the most complex investment grade audits, provide detailed analysis of specific energy using equipment or subsystems in order to provide the detailed view for planning capital intensive investments. This is considered the gold standard and provides reassurance that business and sector specific energy profile are being taken into account. Thinking about other ways that we can categorize audits or think about how audits function is to look at their end uses. So building energy use focuses on the use and operation of buildings requiring the provision of services such as heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting, hot water, and transportation systems within buildings, so escalators and lifts. In addition, energy is used by appliances within the building. So when we talk about building energy use, it is a little bit more. It can be a little bit more complex than what we might consider for a residential audit. For businesses that don't rely on transportation or have high process energy, so lots of businesses in the service sector, for instance, an audit that only focuses on building energy use may be sufficient. Audits can also consider process energy used directly by a process, so things like furnaces or direct dryers, indirectly by processes, so heat exchange or distillation. This could also be focused on specific conditions of production, so energy that's used at startup or shutdown, or in utility processes, so ongoing motor-driven systems like fans or compressors. And then finally, transport energy use can feature in audits and can be quite a significant portion of a firm's overall energy use. So this applies to energy used in different modes of transport, so road, rail, aviation and shipping, as well as different ranges, so whether they're long or short distances. And then really crucially, what's transported, whether it's goods or people. And then briefly, before I hand over to my colleague David, we know that there are already quite useful, straightforward examples of how an audit set of policies can function. So there's a good example provided by the Energy Efficiency Directive, which the UK had been a signatory to and still dictates a lot of energy efficiency policy. So the idea set out in the Energy Efficiency Directive is quite a straightforward approach. It calls for the development of an audit approach delivered by accredited experts or a national body that would be mandatory for big enterprises and voluntary for smaller enterprises, with governments then having to promote these voluntary audits to the SME sector, with this audit approach being based on European standards. So currently in the UK, we do have mandatory audits for larger enterprises. I'm sure most of the people on the call are aware of the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme for larger firms, but we haven't yet found a standardised delivery of voluntary audits for SMEs. Voluntary audit programmes from accredited experts are far more common in EU countries. So I'm now going to pass on to my colleague David to talk through some of the underpinning standards and regulations and some examples of energy audits in practice. So over to you, David. Well, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jack. So, Leah, if you're okay to click on as I go through the slides, because I need to look at my notes separately. But yes. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm David Weatherall. I'm an associate working with the Energy Saving Trust, particularly supporting European projects and some of the policy research activities. I'm somebody who's worked quite closely on support programs for SMEs over the past 5 years, both looking at some of the issues around that from a sort of analysis perspective, but also more in practice in terms of actually helping to build a support program, including developing an audit process for a government supported energy efficiency assistance and financing program for manufacturing SMEs. I also helped the Energy Saving Trust do a review last year for the Committee on Climate Change on the state of policy and the needs of SMEs in terms of decarbonisation. So hopefully I've got something interesting to talk about, but I did just want to start with a small disclaimer. My presentation is described as focusing on standards, but as Jack sort of just indicated, the issue of standards for SME energy audits is a fairly complex picture, and partly why we wanted to actually have this event today, why we wanted to bring people together, is that it's an area where we found it very difficult to gather information on. I'm not a standards expert, so partly what we're aiming to do today is to really use this opportunity to gather your insights into the current picture in the UK. And if any of you attending this have any additional insight to give or feel like we've got the picture wrong, please do shout out, or really do please feed that insight into the discussion sessions that we'll be having from 11:50 at the end of this workshop. You know, that's a really key part of what we're trying to do here. So do please stay for that bit and feed your information in. Can you move on to the next? I can't see the slide. I can't see what you're showing, Leah, so I'll just tell you to move on to the next slide. Apologies if you've already done it. If we could move on to the next slide, which is hopefully showing the research into SMEs that the Energy Saving Trust undertook for the Committee on Climate Change earlier this year. I think my colleague Emma Bill is going to talk a little bit more about the conclusions of that research in her presentation later in the programme. But I think it is sufficient to say that as we looked at the picture of how the actions SMEs need to take to make their buildings and their processes and their transport more energy efficient, as they sought to reduce their carbon emissions, all stakeholders do see audits, energy audits, as a central part of the approach to help SMEs do that. I think one thing that really came across very strongly in that research, and that's partly the mandate we were given by the CCC, is the immense diversity of SMEs. You know, it's almost rarely helpful to talk about SMEs as a whole sector. The research we undertook considered the decarbonisation support that SMEs need, ranging in types from clothing manufacturers to horticultural businesses to single trader plumbers and electricians. And the attitudes to changing patterns of energy use and cutting carbon ranged from, you know, there's really nothing I can do, I'm a tiny business, what can I do, this is all dependent on my clients, to there's too much I can do, I don't know where to start. And I think it's clear from both ends of that spectrum that audits have to be a part of the pitch, perhaps a central part of the picture of support. But also they have to link up to engagement, because you have to make people understand that there is something they can do before they're going to engage with an audit process. And at the other end, help and find out wider support and financing to actually take action on the information that comes out of an energy audit. So I'd urge you to have a look at the conclusions of that report. And as I say, I think Emma's going to talk a bit more about some of the behavioural perspectives and insight that are relevant to that later in this workshop. So moving on to the next slide, please. Just quickly looking at the international picture of standards. LEAP4SME, the European project that Energy Saving Trust is involved in, and that is the context of this workshop, is a project supporting energy audits for SMEs across Europe. In Europe, as Jack has explained, the Energy Efficiency Directive requires mandatory energy audits for large businesses and voluntary and governments to encourage SMEs to undertake voluntary energy audits. Though the Energy Efficiency Directive doesn't directly require it, most European countries have tended to build their programs around the European standard EN 16247 for the energy audit process, which has separate sub-guidance has guidance both for the overall audit process and separate sub-guidance for transport, buildings and process energy audits. So to give just one example, in Slovakia, for example, you can access a grant for SME energy efficiency, both the audit and funding to then take action on installing measures if you have an assessment carried out by an accredited assessor working to the EN 16247 standard. And that's broadly similar, as I understand it, to the situation in Ireland that Dervla is going to describe for us in more detail later in this session. Just a quick note on sort of the wider picture of that. The international standard ISO 50002 has provided, it's been developed on the basis of EN 16247. And there is, from what I know of it, a very similar standard used in North America under the US ASHRAE program. Now, in the UK, ISO 50002 EN 16247 doesn't have a particularly high profile. It's principally used in the context of, as I understand it, again, tell me if I'm wrong, in the context of the ISO 50001 energy management standard. And that is, of course, relevant to the ESOS program. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Leah. What we do have in the UK is a mandatory energy audit program for large businesses. This was developed in fulfilment of the Energy Efficiency Directive, which, as I say, required mandatory audits to be established in each European country for large businesses and on a voluntary basis for SMEs. And clearly ESOS was introduced before Brexit, and while we were still required to comply with such directives. Now, under the ESOS programme, all large undertakings audit their energy use every 4 years. The audit must be carried out or reviewed by an approved assessor, but there is, as I understand it, a reasonable degree of flexibility in terms of the audit methodologies that assessment can use. However, there was a consultation and plans for developing ESOS that was undertaken by the government last year. And as a conclusion of that, there is a plan to move ESOS processes more towards existing auditing standards, such as ISO 50, well, particularly ISO 50002, from future phases of the programme. And it's also important to note that a separate mode to ESOS compliance is using the whole ISO 50001 energy management standard, which is a way of demonstrating that you met the requirements of ESOS. And I think the final thing I'd say about ESOS is that in that consultation in 2021, as part of a longer term picture, there was a discussion there about extending ESOS beyond just the large undertakings that it currently applies to also cover perhaps more energy intensive SME businesses. And again, looking at the European picture, this is something we see. Other countries such as Portugal, for example, put their energy audit requirements on businesses that that meet a certain minimum threshold of energy consumption, rather than basing it on that standard SME definition in terms of number of employees and turnover, etc. So just moving on from ESOS to the next slide, there is of course an audit that we're probably all very familiar with that applies to businesses, which is the energy performance certificate, required to provide an asset rating of the energy performance of a building, and is required to be produced and a formal assessment to be carried out at the point of sale or renting out of a property. And of course, EPCs have become, over the past decade, of increasing importance in setting directions on energy efficiency policy, for example, in the minimum energy efficiency standards that rented non-domestic buildings have to meet. There's also, though it's of perhaps less importance, the requirement for display energy certificates that show the operational rating, so based on the actual in-use energy use of public buildings, and that's required for any building owned or occupied by a public authority. So from that quick review of the regulated standard, well, the standards and the regulated measures, I just wanted to go on with some quick observations about the market and the state of play for SME energy audits. This is very much based on my understanding, and again, it's something that would be great to have your input on. I wanted to just talk first of all about the situation in Scotland. Scottish Government has its Business Energy Scotland programme, which is something that the Energy Saving Trust currently delivers for Scottish Government. And as part of that programme, SMEs are offered an energy audit that can be delivered over the phone, alongside the collection of relevant information such as energy bills, or it might be delivered through a site visit, particularly where the energy use is more complex. The Business Energy Scotland audit covers typically building energy use, but also process energy use where that's particularly relevant. So the person who's managing that programme for Energy Saving Trust gave me the example, for example, of a farm with grain dryers, which are high energy using equipment. They will often come up as a piece of kit that is recommended for an upgrade to deliver energy efficiency improvements. I should say I've included one page from the multi-page BES audit template there on the slide. It's really not the best page. The audit does look much nicer than that. I'm sorry, I should have chosen a nicer page really, but that's just to give you one sense of the way the audit covers, as indeed any of these audits do, both the assessment of current energy performance and opportunities for delivering improvements. I think the final note I'd make on the Business Energy Scotland process is that it's structured around, and it's really built around enabling SMEs to take action, and particularly by accessing finance through the Scottish Government's 100,000 SME zero interest loan. So a lot of what the Business Energy Scotland audit is aiming to do is to collect the information necessary to enable businesses to provide the information that the managers of the loan programme need to be able to authorise a loan to an SME to make those energy efficiency upgrades. And so it's principally, thinking about the levels that Jack talked through, it's principally a level two audit, though it can incorporate more level 3 investment grade assessments for particular pieces of kit. So coming back again to that example of a grain dryer, obviously more complex information will be needed to be collected to provide the information that the decision makers on the loan need to have than perhaps they would need for example, upgrading a heating system where it's likely to be a much more standard and familiar measure. Now, just turning to the picture more broadly, I think, Leah, I think if you click a button, some bullets should appear. Does that happen?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I think my view of the current picture out there is that there are growing numbers of level 1 online or phone-based tools for initial energy assessments being offered by a number of private and public support bodies, often overlapping with carbon footprint tools. There has been a more limited SME market to date for level 2 or 3 audits, and particularly there hasn't really been much of a commercial market. SMEs don't tend to pay for energy audits, and until the current crisis, I think some public, well, I know some public support programs have struggled to give audits away. And I think one of the most interesting pieces of insight from our colleague who is helping deliver the business energy sports program is that levels of uptake of that audit process are double what they are last year. So under the current crisis is clearly strongly changing the picture in terms of attitude and interest in taking up energy audits. In terms of other entities that are out there delivering energy audits, Carbon Trust has in the past delivered SME audit programs on behalf of governments, and as I understand it, now delivers a commercial service of business energy audits for both SMEs and larger businesses. And there's similarly some commercial sector organisations such as the National Farmers Union offering energy audits to their own methodology, and what the NFU seem to be doing is using their own team of ESOS assessors to offer energy audits to the whole range of farming businesses, many of whom of course will not meet that threshold to need to undertake ESOS, but might be interested in undertaking a agriculturally focused energy audit process. I think the thing that I'm interested in particularly, and something we discuss a lot in the report that we produced for the Committee on Climate Change, is that SME support, public support for SMEs in terms of tackling energy efficiency over the past several years has been tended to be delivered through regional development funding, first of all European funding, and now we're transitioning away from that to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And my understanding, and again it would be great to have insight here, is that many of those programs have developed their own audit approaches and or relied on EPC assessments or assessors. And I think it's perhaps the case that there's been mixed quality for some of those audits, and it's not really clear what areas of energy use those are covering. I think certainly it seems to me there could be scope for more learning between different initiatives around the country that have developed SME audit processes and really sharing best practice and ideas on how they can work. I think related to that is the idea of, could there be more widespread use or uptake of audits to the ISO 50002 and EN 16247 standard in the SME sector, particularly as ESOS is looking to be more strongly based on that 50002 standard, and clearly that would bring us more into line with some of the practice in other countries. So those are just a few ideas, and so if I could just move on to the final slide, Leah. Some of the themes that perhaps it might be useful to discuss in our final session at the end is the scope for a more standardised approach for energy audits to be encouraged in the SME sector? How is the scope for more shared learning and best practice? I think it's helpful to discuss how, to what extent, particularly from the public authorities' perspective, free or heavily subsidised energy audits work in driving action. As part of one of our SME reports produced for LEAP4SME, I dug a bit into the literature of how much people value free stuff, and although there's nothing being done on this specifically in regards to energy audits, there is certainly evidence from other sectors, for example education, about the fact that people wouldn't pay as much for something that's free as something that's paid for. I hope that makes sense, but I think that's certainly a consideration in discussions around energy audits, and particularly around getting energy audit to drive action. People have to think that this is a valuable document, not just something that they've been given. I think it would be really helpful to hear attendees at this meeting's view on what is the level of 1, 2, and 3 audits. So that's ranging from that initial assessment, perhaps online, perhaps over the phone, through to a more detailed picture of all the opportunities, through to that real investment grade audit. Do all SMEs need audits at all levels? Clearly, you can see that a manufacturing business with lots of bespoke equipment is going to be headed pretty rapidly towards the level 3 type audits. But what about a hairdresser? Is there more potential for audits and uptake of audits because of the energy crisis? And I think finally, just touching on the points I made, how does the potential and the market for SME audits differ between business sectors? So that's me. I hope there were more answers than questions than there were there, but as I say, it would be great to have your thoughts on all this. Thank you.
Thank you, David. If there are any questions for David, please feel free to use the chat box so you can unmute yourself and ask these questions. As David shared, these are based on our understanding. So if you have any comments that you would want to share, please feel free to do that.
Shall I come in? I've just got one
Yes.
question that's come through to me, and it's a question to both David and Jack, and I think it's just more your opinion rather than a definitive answer. But so definitions were mentioned in the presentation around SME energy audits. There are many terms used like evaluations, assessment. Would a common language be helpful for SMEs or policymakers, in your opinion? So being a bit clearer, I suppose, on what audits means and what all of the other terms are that are used in this space.
Yeah, do you want to have a stab at that first, David?
Yeah, if that's okay. And then yeah. So I think, gosh, yes, definitely. It's really confusing, and I think one of the things is, again, coming back to the official standards. I mean, I think one of the things that's helpful, if you can get your head around it, is that ISO 50001 family of standards, which covers off different aspects of energy management. And one of the interesting things that's happened recently is that government, really with the targeted SMEs, has supported one component of that, which is a new ISO 50005 standard, which is about energy monitoring, as I understand it. But I think really trying to raise awareness of the different components of what good energy management looks like, of which energy audits are one part, it would be a really helpful role for public authorities in this space.
And the only thing that I would add, and it's much less focused on the standardising the regulations or the language around different types of audits, but I think there's a real branding issue that we did come across when we were looking at some of the earlier LEAP4SME research around calling energy audits, because the association with audits is not necessarily always very positive from SMEs, and so it's not always clear that what they're getting is something that could be really beneficial to their energy use and their business. There's some work perhaps to be done around the use of language and making that appealing when it comes to program design. Yeah, and
good point about it being like creating a better understanding of good energy management in general and not just audits, although I know this session is focusing on audits, but keeping the broader picture in mind is important. And then, follow-on question from that is, if SMEs were to be required to do audits, there would be a need for a lot of awareness raising and increasing knowledge about energy audits. I think that's more of a comment, but yeah, any thoughts on that?
I suppose the only thought that I would have is that I don't think that we have called necessarily for mandatory audits for SMEs. I think that we think that there's value in them being voluntary, but that the offer has to be enticing. And so as part of that offer, there's an awareness raising component to it. I don't think that we've recommended through LEAP4SME that all SMEs should have to undertake energy audits.
No, I agree. I mean, and I think it comes to, it almost links back to the first, which is, there is no, I would feel imposing a mandatory audit requirement on SMEs separate from a wider support infrastructure would not be particularly helpful. And I think it's far better to have an attractive and engaging support program to help SMEs manage their energy use, to help them decarbonise, that then has an audit, probably as something that, as I flagged, probably as something that the SMEs pay for, at least in part, on a voluntary basis. Yeah, that's a good point. And yes, if anyone else would like to ask a question, you can also raise your hand. I should have flagged that earlier. There's a reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand and make a comment verbally. So there's a comment in the chat now from Carrie. So in looking into improved energy efficiency and decarbonisation for SMEs, it seems that there are programmes looking at behaviour change and barriers, and separate programmes on energy audits. Can you tell us more about how these approaches could be brought together to both engage SMEs and enact changes that are based in the evidence and business cases from the audit? You go first, Jack.
I mean, I think so. A big focus of the work that we did for the Climate Change Committee, which was more broad than energy audits. It was focused on SME decarbonisation more generally, but we were really keen to look at what the latest behaviour change research was saying, and how that relates to support programmes in general, but support programmes that included audits or assessments as part of them. I think there probably is, in general, a trend to incorporate more behaviour change research and understanding into programme design. And so I think we are starting to see that. We worked on that project with a couple of really prominent academics who were really useful in helping us to bring together the behaviour change and the energy audits and the sort of programme design. So I think there are programmes out there that are combining the two, but there's been less research done on the behaviour change element of audits specifically, I would say.
Yeah, and then to just so Jack, having come with the behaviour change thing, just to comment on the sort of diversity question. I mean, I suppose I come back to what I say. I think one of the challenges we've got in this sector is that point that a lot of the work on SME support programs from the public sector has been delivered at regional level, and which is fine. That's great. But I do think there could be scope for much greater learning and sharing of practice around making sure to sort of enable us to bring things together, as you're saying, Carrie. And I think also, as hopefully we do see more commercial offers emerging in this space, like I mentioned that example from the National Farmers Union, then I think it would also be good to have some monitoring or some activity to track those, and just to be able to see what's actually going on, what's going on in the space, and what offers SMEs are receiving.
I suppose just a last point, as Dave was talking there again about the CCC work, it was a really interesting learning experience for me to look at some of the academic literature around barriers and the removal of barriers, and how I think we can sort of take it as read that by simply removing barriers, people will do the rational thing of taking up energy audits or taking part in energy efficiency programs, and that isn't necessarily the case. There's work to be done in terms of removing barriers, but that will often only get us part of the way there. There's a whole host of other aspects that play into an SME's decisions to take part in a program like this that are not just related to the immediate barriers of financing or knowledge or awareness.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, good point. Yeah, it's not necessarily just about removal of barriers. Okay, well, I'll leave it there so we allow enough time for our next speaker. So Leah, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you both. So the next presentation is by Derbla Stapleton. She is a program manager at Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. She will share the learnings from the voucher-based SME support program in Ireland. After you, Derbla.
Thanks very much. Just share my screen here and hopefully it all works.
Yes.
You can see that, can you?
Yes.
Is it in presentation mode?
No.
Never works. Never quite works when you want it to.
Yes, now it's working.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Leah. And thanks to the Carbon Saving Trust for inviting me along this morning. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to present on the SEAI support scheme for energy audits. My name is Derbla Stapleton. I'm the Business and Industry Program Manager with the SEAI. So firstly, just I'll run through an introduction who the SEAI are, and then I'll just give some details of why we decided to go with an audit support for SMEs, and then an overview of the SSEA, as we call it, and the data that we're seeing coming from the audits, and then some of the next steps. So the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, we're Ireland's national energy authority, fully funded by the Government of Ireland. Our mission is to be at the heart of delivering Ireland's energy revolution. So we drive the reduction and replacement of fossil fuel usage. So really encouraging people to use less energy and use clean energy. So we support homeowners, businesses, communities, and also policymakers with, we have education and training supports. We also provide grant funding to homeowners and businesses and communities as well. And we've a research and data and insights division. So we provide insight to policymakers. Last year, we funded about 2,500 businesses with €50 million in grant funding, and hundreds or if not thousands of other businesses on engagement and conferences, webinars, that kind of thing. So why an SME audit support scheme? Well, we recognized that we had a challenge in engaging SMEs in energy efficiency. So we surveyed SMEs to understand why it was proving so challenging. And really, the challenges came down to, I suppose, 4 broad themes. The first of all was finance. SMEs have difficulty accessing capital and understanding how to fund energy investments. And as energy bills were increasing, they had less funds available. In addition, typically SMEs don't have the time. They're quite time poor, resource poor. They don't have the time to spend, upskilling, researching technologies, different suppliers, and so they were difficult to engage for that reason. As well as that, they tend not to have the necessary technical expertise or information required to support the decision making related to energy investments. And I think, as David mentioned earlier, SMEs really don't know where to start. Oftentimes they want to reduce energy, they recognize that it's a business imperative, but they really don't know what the first steps are. So in the Irish policy context, the Energy Efficiency Directive has already been mentioned. That's SI 426 in Irish legislation. And we have an obligation to develop programs to encourage SMEs to undergo energy audits. In addition to that, in 2021, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill committed to a 51% overall emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And our climate action plan 2023, the most recent one, just issued just before Christmas last year, set out actions to deliver on the targets to 2030. So this included 35% reduction in direct industry emissions, as well as 1/3 of existing commercial premises to be upgraded to B or B, and retrofitting 50,000 commercial premises with heat pumps. So really those are the actions, but I suppose if you look at the SME journey, before any of the investments carry out, we really need to help and support SMEs to understand their energy use. And then we recommend that they create an action plan, get an energy audit. And these steps need to happen before they make any decisions about investment typically. So we needed to target our supports around those first steps to ensure that the later steps would happen for SMEs. So in reaching the solution, I suppose we identified our objectives in, as I mentioned, engaging SMEs in the topic of energy efficiency and understanding or enhancing their understanding and knowledge of their energy use and the recommendations to reduce their energy. But also we want to provide them with information to support SME investment decisions. So in articulating these objectives, we came to a solution which was to provide, to develop a support scheme to enable SMEs to access a high quality energy audit. And we recognized then that the key success factors in delivering this was to provide easy access to the support through online application. As I mentioned before, SMEs are time poor. They don't have time to download multiple forms, fill in lots of different application forms, print them, send them in. They just wouldn't engage if that was the case. And we knew that from previous experience. And we also needed to make sure that there was a supply chain of energy auditors and energy advisors out there. So as part of our mandate to maintain a register, we're required to maintain a register of energy auditors to carry out audits, obligated audits under the Energy Investment Energy Efficiency Directive. So we already had an register of auditors in place. So we wanted to grow that register for SME audits. And we also recognized the value of the data that we would get from energy audits to inform our future supports for SMEs. So for example, if we were looking at further grants or grant funding for SMEs, we could use the data from the audits to decide where the grant funding would be most impactful. So just going through the scheme itself, the support scheme for energy audits. So it offers SMEs a voucher of €2,000 to get an energy audit with an SEAI registered energy auditor, and it's open year-round for applications. So the eligibility requirements are quite lenient, I suppose you'd say. It's SMEs only. Obligated entities are not eligible. So if you're a large business, you are obliged to get an energy audit carried out under the Energy Efficiency Directive, so you cannot avail of this. SMEs must spend at least €10,000 on energy per year, excluding transport energy. So basically your heating and electricity. And the reason for that is to get good value out of a €2,000 energy audit. I mean, if a business is spending €2,000 or €3,000 on energy per annum, we wouldn't generally recommend that they engage an auditor for such a high quality energy audit. We do have other supports, including energy management training for those types of businesses. And also the business needs to be tax compliant and registered in Ireland. So we developed a dedicated website page within our website and an online application portal, which we felt was crucial to the success of this scheme. Again, it's just to make it easier for the businesses. And then once the businesses were confirmed their own eligibility, they would receive an automatic offer. And we launched it in July 2021, so about a year and a half ago. So our application portal, as I mentioned, is new. We developed it specifically for this scheme. It was based on a portal that we had in existence for homeowners for solar PV, but it was modified for businesses. And really, it was to enhance the ease for businesses to access the grant and apply for it, and just to make the customer journey as smooth as possible. And from our point of view as well, we wanted to be able to administer it quite quite easily so that it would scale up very quickly and we wouldn't be forced to, you know, resource intensively. So the online application portal allowed us to do that. So here's the application process. So the SME applies online to the SEAI for the voucher. We recommend that they contact the auditor in advance. The auditors are all listed on a drop-down menu. We recommend that they contact in advance just to ensure that the voucher will cover the cost of an audit. Any additional costs must be paid for by the SME themselves. But typically we find that the €2,000 meets the cost of most audits. Then they receive an automatic email once they confirm their eligibility. The auditor also receives that email. And then we advise the auditor to arrange the pre-audit meeting with the applicant. So this is really just to check that they have access to their bills when the audit, you know, arrange the day for the site visit. When the auditor comes, that there'll be somebody there to walk them around the site and give them access to, you know, the important areas like boiler rooms, that kind of thing. The auditor then carries out the site visit and completes an audit report and sends it to the applicant. And I'll go into a bit more detail later, but the audit report is a set template developed by ourselves to ensure that the audit is of high quality. Finally, then for payment, we actually pay the auditor directly. So it makes it easier again for the business. They don't have to deal with us for payment. And the auditor submits the report to us. We review it for completeness and we carry out a quality assurance of a percentage of some of them coming through. And once everything's in order, we pay the auditor. So it's a pretty straightforward application process, particularly compared to some of the other grants that we have in place. So as I mentioned, the energy audit report is a high quality report, or as we define it. It includes a one-page dashboard with some of the key findings, and the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, SMEs don't necessarily have the technical expertise. So what we wanted was for them to be able to get the really important information upfront, and they would receive the technical report as well, but they'd have just the nuggets of information that they needed from a business point of view up in that first dashboard, one-page dashboard. So we defined a standard Excel template that the auditor is required to use. So it covers a range of different topics that they have to assess when undergoing the audit. And there's also a standard report template that's submitted to the applicant at the end of it. The report sections include, you know, the typical sections that you'd expect in an energy audit, a description of the site and the fuel use, and analysis of the energy bills, including times of year or day that they're particularly energy intensive, and also it identifies the significant energy users. So it might be, for example, refrigeration or heating, whatever. And we also require that an energy management assessment score is applied. So this goes through different aspects, including whether there's a policy around energy management in place, the communication and engagement with the staff, that kind of thing. And from a renewable technology point of view, we require the auditor to carry out an assessment of the site for heat pumps and solar PV. So is it suitable for either of these technologies to be installed? And then there's a list of recommended actions. And this comes at the end of the report, but also this is really what's brought forward to the dashboard at the end, or at the start. So as I mentioned, the dashboard, it's in portrait. So I'm just breaking it down, split it up here so that you can just see what's in it there, and it'll give you an idea of how, I suppose, simple it is, but it does include a lot of information. So there's an energy performance section in the top right. There's a photo of the site there, and this gives you an indication of where you are at the moment in terms of rating, and we set the standards for the different star ratings, and potentially where you could get to if you implemented all the measures that are identified in the report. There's also then the energy spend, and again, it's your current energy spend and the potential if you implement the recommendations, as well as the emissions. And we felt it was important to include emissions in this, given that the focus is very much on decarbonisation through our own legislation, but also for many SMEs. And then you get the list of recommendations, including the energy savings per year in euro and tons of CO2, the cost of the action and the payback. The payback is very important for businesses. Really, it's a really behavioural thing to support them in making decisions. And then the first step, really, very often we would have another support that's available, so we would signpost into that. Just running through some of the data, as I mentioned, we launched it in July 2021. We had a pretty soft launch before we started advertising it during that summer, just to make sure our systems and everything were in place. But as you can see, it's ramped up fairly quickly, particularly around last summer and autumn, when the energy crisis really started to take hold, and businesses were very fearful, really, of the upcoming winter. So we've issued about 1,600 audits to date. I think that was to the middle of January. So it's in around 120 audits per month. Our payments made, again, there's obviously a lag on these. The payment isn't made until after the audit is completed, but we've paid over 2 million euros. So that means that of the 1,600 audits that have our vouchers that have been issued, over 1,000 audits have been completed. So which is great. We were quite worried that, when we launched it, about audits, our vouchers being issued and not being complete. So we put an 8-month expiry date on the voucher. So businesses are obliged to carry out the audit within 8 months of getting the voucher, or else it expires. So that's driven the actual, I suppose, getting the audits carried out. Just on some of the data that we're seeing, it's manufacturing is the top sector. So about 1/3 of the audits are manufacturing facilities. I suppose, as you'd expect, they need, there's a lot of opportunity there for manufacturing facilities, and obviously they spend a lot of money on energy. Accommodation and food services is also a big uptake there. We have a lot of engagement from hotels right across our supports, and the reason for that, again, hotels spend a lot of money. Obviously, they have big energy costs, but also increasingly in Ireland, anyway, we're seeing that hotels are differentiating themselves, as climate neutral, or carbon neutral, or climate friendly hotels. They want to demonstrate their action from a climate point of view to their customers. So this is a good tool for them to use. And then, as you'd expect, then agriculture, transportation and storage, and arts and entertainment are the other main sectors. Typically, the split of energy consumption is electrical, about 45%, thermal or heating about 25%, and then transport about 30%. So as I mentioned, transport is excluded, I suppose, from the 10,000 euro minimum criteria, but if you meet the minimum criteria, your transport costs are audited. But typically we see that the measures for transport are probably limited to eco driver training, and some fuel switching or switching to electric vehicles. One of the big success factors, as I mentioned, was maintaining or increasing the supply chain of auditors. And what we've seen is, before we launched this, there was 90 auditors on our register of energy auditors, primarily carrying out audits on large industry. We see now that there's been an increase of about over 50%, and we now have 140 auditors, and actually I think a few more in the last couple of weeks, so it might be up to about 150 auditors on that register. And they need to meet minimum requirements and criteria, or in qualifications and experience, to get on the register. Some of the top recommendations that we're seeing, about almost 50% of audits, the auditor recommends solar PV, which is probably, reasonably fair enough. I mean, a lot of businesses want solar PV. They see it as being, it's quite easy to install. It can be kind of, good demonstration, say, for your customers, for example, for your hotel. But also we launched an energy grant last year for solar PV. So other measures that are coming through are energy management, and this is really key. Like 15% are like, when I say energy management, it's like energy efficiency, optimization, that kind of thing. And then also LED lighting, as you'd expect. One of the disappointing things, I suppose, is heat pumps. Only 5% of audits are recommending them, and we're looking at that and understanding why that is. And really, I think it's the cost of making the building ready for the heat pump rather than the heat pump itself. And so just finally on my last slide, some of the next steps. So we launched, as I mentioned, a microgeneration support scheme for SMEs in 2023. So that's for solar PV. It's a pretty small scheme. It's capped at about €2,500 for a 6 kilowatt peak array. We also carried out a review after we'd been running about a year and engaged with the auditors and some of the businesses, and made some recommendations to enhance the scheme. So improving the tools, for example, around fuel switching, it was a bit clunky, but also we wanted to, previously we had allowed businesses to apply for up to 3 audits. So you might have 3 or 4 shops, but to ensure we get value out of our budget, we limited that to 1. And then we're also developing further commercial retrofit grants for launch later this year, and we're using the data that is coming out of our scheme to support that. So the first one we'll look at will probably be a voucher for, or a grant towards optimizing your building controls, your BMS system, and your heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, because we are seeing that's coming through a lot of the audits as a recommendation. And finally, we're going to carry out an independent quality assurance and data review in Q1 of this year, just to make sure that the auditors are carrying out the audits in line with the guidance. So there's more information there. That's the website with the application and all the templates, including the report and the Excel spreadsheet and all of that. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Devla, for sharing that interesting question. I'll hand it over to Adriana to address the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Leah. I see we have a hand up from Anthony. So Anthony, I believe you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, hope you can hear me and see me. Thanks, that was really interesting. Thanks for presenting on that. I have a couple of quick questions, if that's okay, if I'm sneaky. You referred to as an evaluation that's upcoming. As part of that, are you able to collect any information on any actions that have been taken out following those audits? Can you see what, how effective those audits have been in terms of driving further action?
Yeah, so that's, exactly. That is going to be part of that review. So it will be, I suppose, 2-step review. One is to a quality assurance review of the audit report, but also contacting the business themselves to understand whether they have implemented the recommendations, and if they have they delivered the savings, or if they have, like, I suppose, like some of, you'll have seen from the data, a lot of them were carried out sort of last year. Like, we don't want to ring somebody who got an audit in December, so we'll be looking at the audits that were carried out maybe more than 6 months ago, and try and understand if they're delivering on the benefits that they were included in the audit report. But yeah, that's definitely something we're looking at.
Great, thank you. And I guess as part of that, and it might be part of your evaluation, it's useful to understand if, as part of your design of the scheme, whether you ever considered whether there'd be any issues in providing these audit grants to tenants who might not be able to have the ability to make improvements, and whether you thought maybe you should just restrict it to landlords, or just wondering if that was ever part of your thinking.
Yeah, we did consider that, and tenants can apply. So really the unique identifier is your energy meter, the MPRN number, the energy meter number. So if you're a bill payer, you can apply for a voucher. Now, it does, if you have a building that has multiple different occupants, it can get a little bit messy. We have had a few situations where, like, wherever there's any kind of uncertainty, we just talk to people really and try and figure out the best solution for them. And typically in that situation, it's probably usually better for the landlord to carry out the audit on the whole building, and then share the recommendations with the individual businesses. But we have had cases where tenants have carried out audits, and like we do it, the auditor is required. That's actually one of the things they're required to check first. They check whether it's a tenant or an owner, and they have to make sure then that they articulate which the recommendations the tenant can carry out and which they would have to speak to the landlord.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's helpful.
Yeah, no worries.
Great, thank you for that, Devla. And we have some more interesting questions coming through. So the first one is, do any of your activities focus on the supply chain? So in terms of connecting SMEs with competent suppliers and installers, which have the correct training on these new technologies that are coming through in the recommendations, and do you get involved in that side?
No, so I suppose as a government body, we wouldn't recommend one supplier over another. However, what we do maintain are registers of installers. So these are installers who meet minimum requirements, as the person who asked the question mentioned. So for example, where we recommend solar PV or renewable heat, like a heat pump or a biomass boiler, for example, one of the first steps is we would refer them to that particular scheme on our website, and that would include the register of installers. So we'd recommend that the business utilize those registers.
Okay, great. And do you give any information in terms of, aside from what you've just mentioned, what the qualities or aspects a business should look out for when choosing the supplier, sort of what the best practices or any guidance?
Not in the audit, no. Like not in the audit report, I suppose. One of the really valuable things about carrying out an audit is that you have an advisor on your side for a day. So you know that conversation would probably, like if you're where the auditor is making recommendations, I'm sure they probably have a lot of conversations around that in the next steps. But we don't define what we'd expect. But in the, like I mentioned, the assessments, the renewable technology assessments. So for renewable heat, the auditor is required to decide whether the site is actually suitable. So if you're installing a heat pump, do you need to do fabric upgrades? Is there room there? Physical room. So there's a list of criteria that we check first, that we request the auditor checks before these recommendations are made.
Yeah. Okay, great. And there's another question from Sally. Have you or are you considering any form of audit for small SMEs who use less than 10,000 euros of energy?
We have what we call energy management training. So we have an energy management workbook, and it's really a guidance document. And this is for smaller SMEs who maybe just want to go through the process themselves of like understanding their bill, identifying their larger energy users, that kind of thing. And we carry out training for SMEs who want to understand how to use that. It's about a 2-hour training session online with a dedicated with an energy advisor, and they can ask questions then, and afterwards they can avail of, I think, a call with the energy advisor. So we've been training, I think this month we've trained about 190 SMEs in that alone, like the online training. And we also have online training as well. We call it the Energy Academy, which is an online training resource specifically designed for SMEs who have really very little knowledge, and it has about 28 different modules, each of which is about 15 minutes long, and it goes into different things like energy bill analysis, different technologies, there's all sorts of things, behavioural change, office energy efficiency. So, and there's different sectoral ones as well. So we've designed a lot of sort of training and educational supports for businesses who are quite small to get them kind of along along the journey, as I say.
Yeah, that's great. And one more question. So you mentioned that the audits are from your registered list.
Yeah.
And the question here is, were ESOS assessors used to carry out the audits? So is there overlap there between your registered list and the ESOS?
So prior to Brexit, ESOS assessors, if you were an ESOS assessor, you could apply to be on the register, and that was sufficient. But then there was some issue around Brexit where anyone who was an ESOS assessor who was on the register then had to subsequently reapply with and they had to meet the other requirements. So it may well be that I think there was about 7 or 8. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, if any of them are have carried out audits. They might well do. Sorry, don't have that to my fingertips.
Oh, no worries. Thank you very much. And just briefly, just a question from me, linking the themes of that we're discussing today. So it would make sense that if an audit is good quality and it's got high quality, as you say, clear and implementable recommendations, then more businesses would be encouraged to take the next step and implement the measures, which is the crucial step we're all aiming for. So that logic would dictate, but do you also have evidence from your preliminary research that shows that the quality of the audit really does make a difference in moving the SMEs along to the next step?
Do we have evidence that it does make a difference? We did a lot of research before we launched this, and while we were developing the audit template. I suppose there's other studies and other audit schemes right across Europe that we spoke to people who had implemented them. And I suppose the resounding message was the quality of the audit is important. We had previously had a scheme ourselves a number of years ago where we had auditors, we asked auditors to go out and audit a number of businesses. There was no set template or anything like that, and there was a massive difference or variability in the quality of the audits that was coming back, and that was seen as an issue then in delivering on the recommendations. If the businesses didn't understand the recommendations, if they didn't understand the implications of the recommendations or its costs, they just wouldn't carry them out, or if they didn't know like what the first steps were to deliver them, they just wouldn't carry them out. We're already seeing a number of businesses coming through the audit scheme with their audit, and then where we've made recommendations and there are supports available in SEAI, we're already seeing them coming through. So particularly on our we have a community energy grant scheme where communities come together, and we're seeing a large number of businesses becoming part of communities where they've carried out an audit, they recognise that the savings are made, and then they join a community and they can get grant funding that way.
Yeah, no, it's great to get the insight as to how you designed the scheme. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'll hand over back to Leah. So we have a few minutes left.
Thanks, Adriana.
Thanks. Thanks, Devla. Thanks, Adriana. It's 11:14 now, so we will break for a few minutes and we'll resume at 11:20. We will start with a presentation by Emma Bill. She will share the preliminary results from our behavioral research study on what more is needed to make audits more impactful. So hope you guys get some chance to get a coffee or a drink. See you all back at 11:20. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice small break and got a chance to get a coffee. Moving on to the next presentation, we have Emma Bill. She's a researcher at Energy Saving Trust. She will share the results from our behavioral research study, where we are trying to understand the non-economic factors influencing SMEs to take action towards energy efficiency measures. Handing over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Leah. Let me just put this in presentation mode. We did this before, didn't we? How's it looking? Is that okay?
We can see the notes, I think.
Is that still okay?
Yeah, if you head to display settings, Emma, and then press swap display, that should do it.
Okay, let me just, it's like I've got two monitors, so they're sort of switched at the moment. So I think I just picked the wrong screen. Let's try that.
Yeah, it looks good now.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. It's still switched for me, but never mind. As long as everyone can see, that's fine. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today. As Leah said, I'm Emma Bill, and I'm an insight consultant, researcher was a good description, Leah, in Energy Saving Trust's Insight and Evaluation team. So I've been at EST for about a year, been involved in a number of different projects, but SME, energy efficiency and decarbonisation has played quite a big role in my first year. So yeah, being involved in the Committee on Climate Change project, and yeah, this LEAP4SME project as well. So what I plan to talk about today is some ongoing research that we're undertaking as part of LEAP4SME. So the research is on decision making. We talked about what I think during today's session we've touched on how we can get SMEs to audits to become more impactful. So we've touched on, I think there was a question about drivers and barriers. So hopefully this will add a little bit to that discussion. So we're starting from the view really that, to the best of our knowledge, research has identified lots of different factors that can act as barriers and motivators to SMEs, to them to invest in energy efficiency. When it comes to policy and other solutions to improve energy efficiency investment, it's quite common and useful to sort of consider the barriers and drivers that can be perceived as well as real, that sort of are present at these different levels. So the macro or the external environment level, the firm level, often called the meso. So that's like the firm characteristics, processes and strategies. And then also the micro level. So there are all of these barriers and drivers working at these different levels. So I think that's just useful to obvious, but sort of useful to start as to where we're going with this research. The research I'll speak about today focused primarily on the sort of micro level. So what we were looking at was the barriers and drivers that exist at sort of the individual employee level, and in what context some of these individual barriers and drivers have been studied as well. And we'll call these throughout sort of internal stakeholders. So the people that make up the SME is what we're talking about, whether that's owner manager, a dedicated energy manager, or frontline workers as examples. So of course, we know that there are lots of different factors that influence energy efficiency decision making. As we understand it, there is less sort of knowledge or attention on the individuals that make up the organisation and how they impact the decision-making process when it comes to investing in or adopting energy efficiency. So what we want to do as part of this research is summarise what is already known about internal stakeholder influences, and hence the overall aim to understand what is known, as I've just said. And then within that, what we were very keen to understand was what types of internal stakeholder are considered in the outputs that that are out there. That could be the academic literature or other types of publication. I listed a few already, so owner manager, for example, frontline workers. And then we also wanted to answer the question, how do these sort of internal stakeholders influence decision making? So what are the most commonly observed behavioural factors that are cited in the literature? Similarly, I think it was also relevant to discuss the geographies and the sectors. So are there more parts of the world or that are more studied than others when it comes to SME decision making? And are there more sectors that are more represented in the literature? And I guess this sort of takes us to the most important question for us all, and it's what does this tell us about helping SMEs to invest in energy efficiency, and potentially what does that mean for programme and policy design? So just moving on to the first part of the research and where we're at really. So we started by undertaking an evidence review or a rapid evidence assessment to sort of begin to answer those questions in the previous slide. I mean, you may know rapid evidence assessment method. It's an approach used particularly in policy-based research to support decision makers. And I guess the benefit of rapid evidence assessment in this context really is that they can be completed in a shorter timescale compared to, say, a systematic review. So 2 to 4 months, for example, to gain a sort of quick understanding of what's currently out there to inform any future research, which I'll move on to. So in order to sort of pull together, if you like, this literature and understand and answer our research questions, we identified some inclusion-exclusion criteria for our search, online search, primarily using Google Scholar. And then we defined some search terms. So some of the key search terms we used, unsurprisingly, are energy efficiency, SME, behavioural decision making, non-domestic and non-economic factors. So a combination of those phrases were used to identify the literature, and as I said, primarily via Google Scholar. In this particular presentation, I won't go into too much of the process as to how we got down to the full a sort of list of papers that we looked at specifically. What I can say is that, the search identified around 88 outputs, if you like, and that included academic papers, grey literature. And then by taking those 88 papers through a second screening step, if you like, looking at the abstracts and then referring back to the criteria and what we really wanted to find out, we ended up with 26 papers, and then we looked at those fully and pulled out information within those papers relevant to our research questions. So I'll look at sort of the preliminary results from an international perspective. So we looked for evidence across the globe, but then we'll also, on the next slide, just quickly look at some of the studies that were identified and representing the UK SME context. So if you look on the international level, primarily, it was primarily primary research. Should never use those two words in the same sentence again, but it was mainly primary research that was conducted. There were some reviews, so papers that looked at similar to what we're doing here, papers that pulled together sort of what's happening in energy efficiency decision making. Some of those reviews, there were a lot of reviews, but some of them they included decision making in the domestic energy efficiency context as well, or they were looking also at large corporates. So we did exclude those reviews that looked at the domestic and as I say, the large corporates. So of those we looked at with the primary research, the method sort of used to understand decision making barriers and drivers were interviews and questionnaires with SMEs, sometimes SME representatives or sort of other stakeholders. There were several case studies. That's quite a common method we found, and also evaluations of existing programs. That was also quite common as well. In terms of sector on the international level, manufacturing was very, it was a more common sector. Probably the majority of those 26 papers covered manufacturing, and that included things like metal, textiles, chemical and petrochemical industries, and also timber processing. And I guess this goes back to Derbler and the sort of results from the Irish side as well, that representation of the manufacturing and the opportunities there owing to their sort of energy intensive nature and associated regulation, perhaps in some of the larger ones at least. There were a few studies on sectors such as horticulture, building, construction, hospitality, also mentioned in the Irish context, and retail as well. So these sort of manufacturing studies, and particularly horticulture, was very European focused, particularly Italy, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, just to name some of the countries that came up there. And of course, we know that the context is quite different in the UK. So for that reason, just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the studies that we identified in the UK context. These included studies that looked at the building and construction sector. That also included sole traders and small sort of micro businesses with up to less than 10 employees. And again, in the retail and hospitality side, the studies focus primarily on those smaller SMEs. So I guess looking at these, thinking about the sort of smaller SMEs and sort of the UK context as well, what came out was the need really for there were firm specific energy requirements. I know Derbler talked a little bit about the significant energy users as a section in the Irish report, which I found quite interesting, because when it does come down to that level, refrigeration, which came up here sort of in the hospitality sector, was a significant energy cost for some of those SMEs studied. And then other smaller retailers, material goods, it was the lighting, the heating, air conditioning and ventilation that sort of comprised the largest energy cost. So there are these differences related to the processes involved in the SME, and it also goes back to their business as well. What are they selling, and how that is really important when it comes to audits. So I guess what this means is that energy audits need to be quite flexible to consider these distinct features of different SMEs, and helping businesses understand and identify improvements that they can make in light of these distinct features. So it does require that knowledge on part of the auditor, and the audit needs to be designed, as I say, to be flexible. So here we have a slide, and what we're showing here is the review sort of resulted in a list of behavioural factors, so the drivers and barriers that can influence SME decision making and investment. So these are some of the key barriers and drivers shown here, and I've sort of presented them in terms of those decision making factors that are related to the professional context or they're industry related, and then also the personal employee attributes. So these are sort of decision making factors at the individual level, really, which is what we were looking at here. So just sort of starting on the sort of professional decision making factors here, what came across quite strongly was that sharing information, contacts and learnings through professional networks and memberships, that can be done, that's quite an effective solution. And this can be done across sectors and across geographies. There are links with some of these factors here with the Committee on Climate Change report, which I'll touch on in a moment as well. So being part of these networks can allow SMEs to access information more readily, and especially if it's sort of a trusted group of local industry stakeholders. And some, I think, again, just going back to the CCC research that we did, it was clear that some SMEs, because of the sector they're in or where they're located, are more able and likely to engage in these networks than others. That could be related to the availability of networks in their area, the sort of the norms, if you like, in their profession or sector, or indeed some of the well-known barriers such as time, resource, that we know constrain small businesses and micro businesses in particular. Increasing internal competencies as well with regards to energy efficiency. Some organisations and sectors may be more inclined and able to invest in developing internal competencies of their employees, whether that's through training and upskilling, and that they might be more driven to do that because it's related to their business model or their strategy to meet certain standards. I keep referring back to your presentation, Deborah, but I just found it quite interesting how there were a lot of consistencies here. So if an organisation is, like you were talking about hotels being wanting to differentiate themselves, so of course if that is integral to a business is what they want to be, then they may be more inclined to sort of increase those and invest in increasing internal competencies and knowledge of energy efficiency as well. Or likewise, if they have a sort of strategic priority to move into a new market, here we can use the example of in the building and construction industry. I know from the, again, CCC work we did in that industry in particular, if small tradesmen, installers were making money by continuing to install and replace boilers, that was also a barrier to change there, particularly if you're small and you're still making money, your business is still relatively going fine, you've got customers and that's what customers are asking for. That's quite strong, that comes across quite strongly as well. And just a little bit here on prevailing technologies. So for some sectors, we know it might be difficult to invest in energy efficient technologies, especially if no one in your network or competition has gone there before, or there isn't sufficient market demand related to what we were just talking about in construction. And this was true, this is also true in the horticultural sector. So SME representatives in this sector in the CCC report, they talked about concerns that technological solutions, or some technological solutions, were not yet viable. And then moving on to the personal and the employee attributes, there's evidence in the literature for the following factors, in particular, the fact that decisions to invest can be related to the management, so that could be the business owner, their sensitivity to energy efficiency, or indeed wider sort of environmental issues and climate change, and also staff ambition, having a certain mindset, and these three factors here, the final 3 bullet points on this side, came up in relation to the construction sector. So having pride in your work, developing and maintaining positive working relationships with your customers and suppliers, and also the variety and challenge. So I think if we take those 3, thinking about the variety and challenge, that could very well be an interest in, I don't know, heat pumps, and wanting to understand more about the technology, and offering that as an option. And again, pride in work could go both ways. Perhaps you want to do a good job, and you're not comfortable with newer technologies, or vice versa. You might want to offer those new technologies. So yeah, I think these are the factors that came out quite strongly, and they're listed here. And I talked at the start about sort of the final research question, really, and I guess this is what we're all here for, really. You know, how does what we know, or what is out there, how does that influence solutions for energy efficiency, investment, and audits as well? So just on this slide, I wanted to cover a few of the sort of recommended solutions that were found in the literature. So I get this is based on the research of others that, you know, were identified through the rapid evidence assessment. So some have talked about the importance of engaging SMEs in terms of their strategic priorities and values. So really this is about taking into consideration the business model, why do they do what they do, and ensuring what is important to them, as we've got here. And I think sort of touched on that it's really important, of course, that any venture is financially sound. It's an essential for most, if not all, SMEs. But are we talking SMEs? Sorry, but are we talking about an ambitious, high growth SME? Are we talking about a small family business, a local farm shop, or other business that's serving a specific community or customer base? So I think the value, what is trying to, you know, the solution here really is about the fact that the values held by those who make the decisions to invest or not in energy efficiency are going to vary depending on who you're talking to, where they are, what their goals are. And that, of course, can also change over time as well. We've seen the impact of the cost of living crisis on audit uptake or interest in that. So these things will change over time as well. And this information will likely guide the type of audit that best suits their needs. So I think David, you shared some questions earlier that hopefully we're going to talk about after this session. So that you know, we can cover that and talk about the types of audits that different SMEs need. So other solutions that came out of the review were event-driven intervention. So this is support delivered by local trusted stakeholders or middle actors, as they're sort of referred to in the literature. I guess by nature, this requires a collaborative approach, a reliance on third-party tradesmen, supplier or broker knowledge, if we're talking about energy contracts, for example. And I think in practice, what this solution means is it's about aligning energy advice and improvements with business milestones and business change. And it does require incentivising on the other side, other actors, supporting actors, so tradesmen, energy and other suppliers to support small businesses to become more energy efficient. And of course, again, we talked about the challenges briefly with the Irish context. Not all SME owners will have their own property. They may be leasing, sharing a building with multiple occupants and multiple uses. So not all SMEs will have a direct contract with their energy supplier, and they won't have the authority to make changes to the building space. So I think with this solution, it's about and yeah, you know, we can talk about this. There might be plenty of other ideas out there. This is about understanding when and what are the opportunities for these sort of other actors to come in and engage with SMEs. And it does rely on a wider support network to influence decision making as well. So it's not just down to the individual. And I guess this goes back to sort of what we were saying at the start, the fact that there are all these barriers and drivers that exist at different levels, the external, the firm and the individual. So it's always it's always important to bear that in mind. And then the final recommendation that came out of the review that a lot of experts talked about was the basic knowledge and awareness of energy efficiency issues. So the need for SMEs to have that basic understanding, and suggestion that that could be provided as part of professional education, for example. But then having said that, we know that what information SMEs need is different. You know, so different SMEs and different groups of SME will need different information. So I think there are two parts here. There's having the basic understanding of energy efficiency issues, but then also from an auditor perspective, having that understanding of an experience really of being able to identify and communicate potential and alternative improvements. So it's not just the cost of the investment that needs to be communicated, it's about what are the risks around that. Are there any alternatives to the recommendations suggested? And if applicable, what are the longer term solutions? I think again, another thing that sort of came up is SMEs may, particularly if, you know, they may not have the longer term objectives that larger firms might have, might be a 3-year plan, for example, and how does that interact with what improvement options are suggested? Where might they be in the future? So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's extremely complicated and difficult to advise, but I guess the more personal it can be, it you know, can help. There's just a final bullet point here about availability of public and private funds. So this is really about business networks, relevant government agencies, distributing this sort of information and ensuring that managers and employees within SMEs have knowledge of what funding is available. And also that came up was instructions as to how to apply for certain funds. I know Derbler again talked about the process in the Irish context, the way that sort of the responsibility sat with auditors. So again, just understanding of what the process is and what do SMEs need to do in order to get that funding. I think that takes us to the end of this presentation, but I'll hand back to Leah. Thank you for listening, and I'll see some of you shortly in the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for sharing the preliminary results from the research. We're running a little short on time, so I will quickly hand over to Adriana to address the questions that you might have for Emma. Thank you.
Can I stop sharing?
Hi. Thank you, Emma. That was really interesting, and yeah, highlights the aspect that sometimes doesn't get discussed so much, which is the behavioural aspect. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or raise your hand. And in the meantime, I know we're running out of time, but just briefly a comment and question from my side, Emma, and it's just about your opinion more so than anything else. But it seems like the research that you've done so far and the recommendations that are coming through show that tapping into values and priorities of SMEs is really a key part of the puzzle. And whereas an auditor, I think, could do a great deal of educating their clients around energy efficiency and building that awareness around the technical aspects of energy efficiency, it seems like that tapping into values and priorities of an SME does fall outside of the scope of the typical job description of an energy auditor. And my question is, do you think that aspect should actually be brought into the conversation that an energy auditor would have with a client? Or would it be better if that engagement in terms of values and priorities comes from somewhere else? And if so, where would that be? Would that be an advice service or a network or another support avenue?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess there are pros and cons for doing it either way. What I would say is, when you were asking the question, it popped into my mind that when going through the papers, one of the barriers was related to previous experience of energy audits. So I think SMEs having an experience where they felt they were being pushed down a certain way, whether it was a certain technology being sold or that side of things. So I definitely think the discussion on values and priorities sort of flips it around, and it makes the decision more about the SME rather than what somebody is trying to sell or put in front of them. And I think that develops trust as well. So I definitely think it's important for potentially the auditors to have that conversation as well.
Okay, trust is an important factor in this, but it's good to keep it front of mind. Okay, I don't see any other questions for Emma, so thank you very much for sharing your presentation, and I will hand over to Leah now, who will tell us what we're about to do next.
Okay, thank you both. So now we will break into 3 groups. Emma, Jack, and Adriana will be in each of these groups to guide the discussion. And we will see you all back at 12:25 for closing remarks. We hope to have a rich discussion on seeing what more we can do or how to make more effective energy efficiency measures in SMEs. Thank you. We will be breaking into groups now. I think everyone is back. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Adriana to give the closing remarks.
Thanks, Leah, and thank you everyone who's still here and stuck around for the discussion. In the room I was in, we had some really great input and feedback, so thank you very much for that. I'll just pick out a few interesting points that were made in the discussion group that I was in, and I'll invite Jack and Emma to add anything that they would like to onto that. So I think in our group there was an agreement that a standardised approach for audits would indeed be useful, and a common language would certainly help, not only for scaling up programs and delivery of audits, but also when we're looking at comparisons between programs and comparisons internationally. Trust came up as an important factor in encouraging SMEs to take action. It wasn't just about the information and the standards, but also from the SME's perspective, could that SME trust that that information was suitable for them and didn't have another agenda in terms of pushing another technology. And yeah, in terms of subsidising audits, I think that was viewed as something positive, but also it needs to be part of a wider support package, and also that follow-up post-audit is incredibly crucial. And an audit on its own, you know, it could fly off the shelf, it could work, but what happens after that audit takes place, and there needs to be some support there. So yeah, that's, I think, the key points, and thank you to everyone who is in that group. Anything to add to that, Emma and Jack?
I had a couple of things on, so it was really interesting. Our group was with Amy and Owen, and so Amy's from Low Carbon Dorset, one of the ERDF funded programs, and Owen is from SEAI, and so we had a really interesting conversation about national versus local approaches to delivering advice on these kind of schemes, which was really interesting. I think we sort of all recognise that having free or heavily subsidised energy audits was the best way to drive uptake, but that had to be coupled with really useful, valuable advice. As part of the kind of discussion around the ERDF and the Shared Prosperity Fund replacement, we talked about the value of kind of learning lessons and sharing experiences, and how it seems that while some of the shared prosperity funding will be able to make up for the ERDF, that projects are having to prioritise where that funding goes. And so, but while I don't think it's been, I think we say it hasn't been decided, the prioritisation has been to use the SPF funding for advice, not just for SMEs, but for community groups as well, which is really interesting. And I'm trying to think of some of the other things we talked about. Something that we had a good conversation about was peer networks and working with kind of business business groups like the FSB, or with local kind of chambers of commerce, that kind of thing, and the value of that, and incorporating that into national schemes as well as local schemes. Yeah, I think that's some of the key takeaways.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks. And we're at 12:30 exactly, but Emma, if you have any really brief, great nuggets of wisdom to add.
Don't want to keep everyone, sorry, past 12:30, but yeah, we just say thank you to Sarah, also from Low Carbon Dorset. Yeah, and I think what we talked about, standardised audits, great, but who would do that? Who would be responsible for that? What would it look like? Would it be guidance? And particularly in the context of micro businesses who are very different and perhaps more like domestic consumers than they are larger corporates. Subsidies help. They're still having expressions of interest, so there is a demand. Independent advice is really important. Yeah, and yeah, I'll leave it there. But yeah, thank you for hanging around, Sarah, and having that discussion with myself and Leah.
Great, thank you all. And just to finish off, I've just posted the link to the evaluation questionnaire in the chat. So if you'd like to take a few minutes to complete that, that would be great. And also a link to LEAP4SME, where you can hear more about future events. And we will be circulating a follow-up email with links to presentations and the feedback survey after the event. So again, thank you very much for being here today, for staying till the end. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.